Hello, I'm Corgent. You might recognize that name from GitHub and from Reddit. I have been an activated developer since November of 2018, and I have decided that the players might want to know a little bit more about what I've been working on. I will discuss bugs and features that I'm working on, plus immediate and long-term plans in this blog that I will plan to release every 4 to 6 weeks. This can get a little technical, which is why I will add timestamps in the description if you so choose to skip to a particular topic that you wish to see. A quick note, a PR is a pull request. That means I, or any other developer or contributor, is making a request for the repository or the repo to pull the code onto itself. That means you are basically making an official request to add your item or code or feature to the game. Pull requests are the main way we get code added to the game. In fact, 99.9% of things that are added to Cataclysm are via pull requests. The thing I want to talk about the most in this blog is nested containers. Now, nested containers has been in progress for about 8 months from me, and I will talk about that in more detail in a different section. But the pull request that I made actually closed an issue that was 7 years old. What this means, or I could say what this implies, is that it was very hard. And yes, it was very hard. It touched a lot of things in the code. If you looked at the pull request, it was 8,000 lines of code. And that was just to get the first part working. I know there's a lot of bugs in it, and I am steadily working on each of those bugs that pop up. In fact, I will talk about a couple of the bugs that I fixed recently. My favorite thing that I implemented right after the main PR was called multi-insert, which allows you in your inventory menu to select an item, hit insert, and it allows you to use multi-drop in order to select multiple items to insert into an item. This is a pretty important quality of life thing, and it can definitely be improved upon, but I would think that this is basically the bare minimum in order for the micromanagement to be playable. Now, micromanagement is actually not the highest priority item on the list of nested containers, because you might expect that people like micromanaging, but they don't. You want to be able to not have to think about it unless you really want to, and that's what I'm going to be addressing in the favorites feature. One bug that I wanted to mention that was actually very short-lived, but is kind of funny, is when you open the consume menu, right after the PR was merged, if you opened the consume menu, it showed you everything in your inventory. It showed you your backpack, it showed you all the containers, and it said on the right, this doesn't look edible. Now, of course, it's not edible. You can't exactly eat a tin can unless you could eat a tin can, which was a different bug that I fixed. It was actually a very short-lived because I managed to fix it the next day or within the first 3 days. And if I recall correctly, not a whole bunch of people jumped onto nested containers because they knew that it was going to be pretty buggy right when it started. And it is. I'll admit that. Another very important thing that had to be fixed was the inventory menu was not showing categories. Now, I actually had implemented a kind of a priority system so that it showed you like, here's your backpack, and then here's the stuff that's inside the backpack with indentation. And actually that was a request on Reddit about 2 or 3 months ago about how they wanted it to show. And I come to find out when people were playing it, they actually didn't want that. So I made it a toggle. When in the inventory menu, you can press semicolon and it will toggle between the category mode and the single column mode. Now there's still a little bug to work out in the column mode to be able to show the indentation correctly, but know that I will be fixing it pretty soon. Now, one of the major bugs now is sewing hits. It's a very misnomer of the title of this bug, but basically the long and the short of it, you can't reload sewing kits, you can't reload jackhammers with gasoline, matches, basically any tool that has charges but doesn't actually load an ammo or a magazine. It's broken right now. I've been working with Yutna on the gun related code and the reloading code and the ammo set code, and he's been so kind as to write some Python scripts to migrate the JSON of the items to use the pocket system. Now, when everything's all said and done, and if you're a modder, you'll need to pay attention, everything that is a container, that is a magazine, that can hold a magazine, anything that you can put something inside of needs a pocket of some kind. Each of these pockets are different, and each of these pockets are specialized. I'm not going to go into the details of what the pockets are because the documentation is pretty extensive, and you can ask me on the Discord. The technical description is the ammo capacity function did not take a parameter. So you didn't know which ammo you wanted the capacity for, and that kind of went down a rat hole into finding out that ammo set needed some logic going on, and you needed a new pocket type called magazine well, so you could put magazines inside of it so that you wouldn't have to check if what's inside the pocket is a magazine or if it's an ammo. And that kind of ran into the ammo consume function, and all of the tests started to go wonky. So this pull request is fixing what you might expect is a simple bug, but I've actually been working 12-hour days for the past 5 days trying to get this all in order. I'm hoping to have it merged very soon, but I cannot give you a definite time for that, simply because I've been running into issues left and right. Now, one thing I'm pretty excited about is nested containers will actually enable pneumatics. Now, real pneumatics, where you can have a gun and you have to supply it carbon dioxide or compressed air, whichever. I've actually paintballed before, so it was actually carbon dioxide. And other pneumatics might need electricity or whatever, but you supply the air and you supply the bullet, and they have to take both in order to fire the weapon. This is called MutiMag. You may see it on the GitHub or the Reddit occasionally. This is something that I'm not going to be working on, but Yutna will be taking the reins on that particular feature. He's kind of hanging back, waiting till nested containers infrastructure is mostly in place. And there's a couple of pretty important bugs that I'm fixing before that can really happen. But I'm pretty excited. I'm thinking MutiMag is going to make it in for stable 0.f. So stay tuned for that. That's going to be very interesting, and we're going to actually see some real pneumatic weapons, unlike the weapons that were obsoleted that people were pretty upset about. If you've ever wanted to give back, I have a GitHub sponsors and I have a PayPal. I don't like advertising myself, but since I'm making a YouTube video, it's pretty important to me that people who want to give back can. One of the very important user experience features that I'm going to be working on in the immediate future is the Pocket Favorites idea. Now, this, in a general sense, will allow you to assign priority and category and a specific item to a pocket. There's not really a whole lot to say other than that because I haven't started working on it, but it's very important. It's on my radar, and I've even marked it as high priority on the issues list. Another pretty important thing is to reflavor pack mule and disorganized and make sure they actually do something. Right now they're actually broken. You might think that they add volume, but they don't do anything right now. Related to that is debug storage doesn't do anything. So if you do a lot of debugging, you're going to need to find a different solution. Another feature that I'm going to be adding sometime in the immediate future, which is, 2 to 4 weeks, is interacting with items on the map. The general idea is that you can open up an inventory screen for a map tile, so you can basically, you can choose to pick up an item or activate an item or whatever you choose there. It's kind of a lower priority thing, but I wanted to have an algorithm for obtain cost, which means, say you have a backpack and you have a bunch of stuff in it. I wanted the cost of grabbing an item out of that backpack be related to how much stuff is in there, so that it costs more to grab an item out of a backpack than a holster, because a holster only has one item. Some of you might be asking, why did it take you 8 months to do this project? And you want to know a little bit more of the specifics. You might not know this, but before I started contributing to the project, I have never touched C++ before. I had some experience in C in college and some other lighter programming languages such as Lua. But jumping into this project and jumping into nested containers was kind of jumping feet first in the deep end of the pool. 8 months ago, I kind of made a prototype of like a Pocket class. And that was easy enough, but I needed to know, okay, well, how does everything interact? How do you actually interact with an item? So I made a little inventory function, and that was easy enough, but then I realized, well, wait a minute. Item location? Visitable? What's that? These two things, plus the inventory code, are actually the most arcane parts of our code base. The visitable interface, the visitor pattern is what it uses. If you can look that up on Wikipedia. The visitor pattern is, in a nutshell, or at least what we use it for, is you add a lambda to a function, and that lambda will act on all of the items inside of an item, including itself. Basically, it's a very fancy for loop. And I needed to understand what an item location was, because item locations keep track of where they are. And with nested containers, I needed a special one that's like, well, I'm an item inside of an item. The item location in container was actually one of the first things that I was delving into, and that took me a couple of months to kind of get into. And I realized that the game inventory function, that's when you press I and then you press enter on an item, it shows you a couple of, A, activate, E, eat, R, reload, U, unload. That's the game inventory function. I realized that none of that knows where the item is, which runs into a lot of problems. I needed to convert all of that to item location. That actually took me like 3 months. If you follow the GitHub a lot, you might have noticed a number of refactors on my part to allow that. And there's still a lot of references and pointers that I really wish were item location, and that is another project. The other thing about that is nested containers was always kind of like my pie in the sky. I needed to understand as much about the code base as I could before working on it, because it as one of the other developers said, I groped the entire code base. If I remember correctly, I had over 150 files that I touched in the original PR. And that's pretty crazy. Especially for a pull request, which pretty much everyone on the merge team wants you to try to keep it under 200 lines of C++. And nested containers is kind of a special case, because you couldn't do less than 200 lines because it just wouldn't compile. The single file for item pockets was long enough that it would be its own PR, but it doesn't do anything because it's dead code. It just doesn't do anything unless you add some functions in the code base, such that I couldn't PR that by itself. It wouldn't work. the other things I work on are also important to me as well. Now, nested containers isn't my whole world, but it has taken up a large amount of time. The other things, recently I added a new monster called the Necro Boomer. I thought it was a pretty fun idea. It'll explode and then upgrade all the zombies nearby. And you might know that I'm the author of Magiclysm. I have been wanting to make a pretty large Magiclysm update that includes new classes and a couple of other important features like spellbooks requirements, so that for example, if you want to learn a fireball, you already have to know Finger Firelighter or something like that, so that it kind of adds a little bit more of an idea of progression, and it will allow me to revisit the experience curve and how long it takes for you to learn spells. Because right now, it's kind of half and half. Like, people say it takes too long to learn spells. People say it's too short to learn spells. And I wanted spells to kind of have a general, like, curve where you get to endgame and you're fighting to get spells to keep you endgame. Guns kind of like ruin that progression curve. Another one of my pet projects is writing the artifact system. The artifact system is actually very, very old code, and I'm pretty certain that it is code that Wales even wrote. So it's not very data-oriented. It is kind of obtuse. It's really only meant for the one person who wrote it to understand it. So the plan is to rip it all out, make it all JSON, and then add some more procedurally generated artifacts. Now, what this could mean in the future, not the immediate future, is that artifacts will eventually be able to be more varied. You won't always have, the cube, the architecture cube, whatever it's called. The clairvoyance artifact won't always have the same name, or items won't always necessarily have, haunted shadows. It means that it'll summon shadows or something like that. And it'll allow you to add new artifacts that kind of will do some things that you would consider magic. It was pretty important to me to add this system because I wanted to add something like enchanting to Magiclysm. This is a very long-term project for me because I've talked about this maybe 6 months or more ago with other contributors to Magiclysm that I was considering doing, which kind of had to be put to the wayside because I had other things I ended up doing. Some pretty important things to mention about artifacts is they are passive, active, there's artifact recharge effects, and there's like effects where you get hit, and all of these artifact effects are hard-coded. I've been wanting to make it so that you can have all of the artifact effects that were previous legacy code in JSON. And this will mean that you will be able to use the spell code to create new artifacts that will boost your stats or something like that. Now, Magiclysm already makes some usage of that with the rings of dexterity, etc., that I'm going to have to revisit because I've seen images of people wearing 10 plus rings, and I'm like, no, guys, that's not how rings work. In practically every fantasy, you can only wear 2 rings, maybe you can ring 5 rings, but I'm going to try to skip it to 2. In any case, the artifact rework is one of those kind of infrastructural projects that you might necessarily not know what's happening around you unless you're paying very close attention to the GitHub. Speaking of infrastructure, I did want to give a little footnote to some other infrastructural things that I've been working on off and on. If you are not a coder, you might not necessarily notice any effects from this at all, but I'm working on completely obsoleting the player class in favor of character and avatar and NPC, because player was kind of used to be the player character, but then it kind of got used as NPC, so now it's wibbly wobbly, and it doesn't really have a place. Some other things I wanted to do is implement generic factory in monsters and items so that copy from actually will start to work for generic factory items, hopefully soon. Well, soon is kind of maybe in 8 months. I'm hoping to finish the infrastructural projects by 0.f stable, and they are on the project list, but if they have to get pushed back, they can be because of the other bugs that appear in nested containers and any other large feature rewrites that I have.